box, they came in different varieties, but a box of 40 bullets was called 40 Dead Men.
And Fred, so you're trying to decide whether to take Ike forward or bring Jesse somewhere into a new book?
Yeah, I always have stuff going. I have 40 pages of a new Jesse book and 40 pages of an Ike book. So I don't know. We'll
It was
see.
really interesting to see Ike's grandfather show
Yeah,
up.
Sam.
Yeah, he'll show up and set up his little.
Yeah, if we do this, one of the Schwartzes will show up
Yeah.
from time to time as well. Yeah.
I always want to just pry Fred's head open and pull out what's inside it. I mean, seriously, what if you don't like coffee? I mean, this is a difficult, it's very difficult,
I was
Fred.
thinking about doing science fiction next. I'm taken with cell phones and the way people live in them. And so at some point in the future, that phone will be you. Because all this stuff will go up in a cloud someplace. And that's where you really are.
Artificial
And
intelligence.
so
carried
instead
to
of
that
putting
level,
people
huh?
into jail, they just erase you. You would cease to exist. But as a precedent for it, if you lived in Africa years ago and you lived in villages, and the village was your life, and the way they punished people was to make them go away. You couldn't live there anymore. Well, guess what's over there? A pride of lions ready to have you for lunch. You would take your bad behavior just so far and no farther, because if you took it too far, you would be kicked out of the village and you would cease to exist. So I thought, well, that's an interesting thing, and then people, you could, and if you
Susan, come on,
have this,
rein it in.
if that phone is who you are and someone switches accounts, do you become that other person? Because that's all you know about yourself is what's on this thing.
You've got an imagination.
Well, some people say you're crazy.
I've always been sorry that I missed Fred's sermons, you know, when he was in the pulpit, because if you talk about digressions, we're sort of known for our digressions during October. I just could only imagine where Fred was going, on the road to Damascus or something, and the next thing you know, here's Fred.
Well, maybe.
Too funny.
Oh, I wanted to say too about the title of the book, Copper Kettle. You took that from the Joan Baez.
I did, and then I was going to record her so I could play it for you. And she changed the lyrics. Now I had the original disc back when we had records before they got popular again, for reasons that make no sense at all. And the last verse is it goes. My grandfather made whiskey, his grandfather did too. We ain't paid no whiskey tax in 1792. She changed it to, my grandfather made whiskey, my grandmother did too. We haven't paid any income tax since 17, which makes no sense at all. And so I was very, it's a terrible, to make that into a protest song made no sense at all. There are better things that you can do with that song than, it's just a shame, just a shame.
Well, I like that though. I recognize that right away. It
Yeah.
goes to show where my generation. But also we were talking about recipes in the books. In my Ravenmacher book, the recipes are what to feed sick people. So if you need to know what sort of food to feed someone who's been ill with the flu, that's what I've got in there.
Chicken soup.
Chicken
Absolutely.
soup, yeah, chicken
Jewish
soup.
penicillin.
Jewish penicillin, as we call it,
Yeah,
right?
right.
Full of vitamin C.
I did a recipe once.
You did.
Yeah, in sugar. I had everybody was doing recipes, and I thought, I cannot resist this. I had an auntie who used to have, her favorite canapé was, in God's truth, asparagus roll-ups. And she would, the canned asparagus? It's dreadful stuff. She would take white bread and cut the crust off, and then put a little mayonnaise in there and roll them up and put a toothpick in. And that was her asparagus roll-up. And I thought, this is really terrible. I'm going to put it in a book. So Joker has a recipe at the back. So if you want to make asparagus roll-ups, buy the book.
It gives white on white an entire new meaning, doesn't it?
It was just all They were terrible.
You know, when I first started writing my books, and I started putting old-fashioned, old country recipes in the backs of the books, and I thought I was being very, you know, very original about it. But every book on the face of the earth now has recipes in it. And they're usually they're tasty, good food. But when you talk about asparagus roll-ups, I thought it would really be interesting to do a book that had like 1950s recipes in it, because it, you know,
Be mostly
Soup.
yeah, that's right.
Soup or Jell-O.
Campbell soup and rice, Uncle Ben's rice, or
Tuna.
Canned casserole.
Jello, spam.
Spam. They still eat it in Hawaii. It's a real,
Oh, yeah,
it's sort of like a
It's a
staple
national dish.
in
Hawaii, yeah.
Hawaiian recipes. Well, actually, I was going to say, before we ask you for questions, that I really love the plots in both of these books. I mean, how it works out, the motives for the murder and all, very unexpected, and I thought unorthodox the way they come together. But what's really interesting is to read about how people lived, and in Donis's case particularly, how would you nurse a really ill person in a time when you didn't have access to any conveniences? I mean, how would you deal with, you know, cleaning them? How would you deal with their laundry? What would you feed them? You know, how would you keep them from drowning in their own fluid? Because it wasn't really that different from pneumonia, in the sense that people's lungs filled up, and, you know, would you lay them down? Would you sit them up? Would you beat on their backs? You know, what would you do if you were a person? And, you know, every once in a while now you see a class like, you know, learn how to make a staircase your ER. Have you seen that? I'm trying to remember if it's in the Republic or the Drone, but they're not kidding. You know, somebody has a heart attack or something, you know, you drop them on a staircase and you can, you know, do this to try to keep them going till, you know, but people didn't know that. So what did they know? And how did they manage, you know,
my
to nurse?
favorite new characters in books. You know how sometimes characters will come in and you kind of fall in love with them, and they get, well, this is Dr. Carney. There's this young doctor who's got a bum leg, so he couldn't go to the war, and the state of Oklahoma had an emergency doctor file. And if the little town was just absolutely desperate, they'd find these doctors that were too old or too broken or too incompetent to go to the war, and send them out to the town. And so this young crippled doctor goes out to this town, and he's got all these fancy new ideas, and Alifair has all these old-fashioned ideas. And so there's
Onions are a critical part.
Onions are critical. Onion, garlic, yeah. So there's some headbutting going on there. But there's a lot of new medicines in the early 20th century, and one of them was aspirin. And
We haven't gotten there yet, though. I thought aspirin was 1920 something.
no, it was because I looked.
You looked it up.
Yeah, I looked it up, and it was brand new, a thing, and people thought that if a little was good, then a whole bunch was better, and so people sometimes poisoned themselves with
But
that.
it did bring fever down in a different way than just putting on cold poultices and all. And I thought Fred dealt really interestingly with, you know, a shift in, he's already told you about industry, but what would you do if you owned a mill and you didn't have enough people to work in it, or maybe the demand was different? How would you shift it to some other kind of manufacturing, which, if you really think about it, is one of the subjects that Mr. Trump is addressing in the Midwest and the Rust Belt, if those jobs are no longer there. Here's a really interesting thing that came up in the event we did last fall with Kyle Mills, and I will ask you all this question. Those who know the answer, do not answer. What is the single largest employment profession that currently is engaging men in America? What do more men do than anything else? You're all looking blank, right? All right. Driving. What is the single hottest technology under development in America? The self-driving car and the magnetic. And so no matter what political stuff is going on, what's really going to happen is that people are going to lose their jobs to technology. It's not to be, you know, foreign trade pacts or other stuff. Technology is going to overcome them. What is the principal employee in an Amazon warehouse?
Robots.
It's a robot. Exactly. It's a robot. So technology, in other words, Kyle's point was that technology is really what is changing jobs and job demand and employment, and if you can't adjust to it. So Fred has that problem in this, rural community and all
When
is
the chestnuts go, yeah.
when the chestnuts go and, the still brings serious penalties and all, and let's say you're a guy who employs a lot of people and you own something, what are you gonna do to employ people? How are you going to change? And there's a woman too, and what's she gonna do? What kind of job is she gonna have? Maybe she got a job like as typist in the war. It's the whole Rosie the Riveter thing, what happened? It was really a problem in England at the end of World. Jackie Winspear, who's gonna be here in March, has written about it. Reese has written about it. Women were ambulance drivers and took jobs. Those of you who saw Downton absolutely saw that, in World War I. And when the men came home, such as did come home, because unfortunately way too many of them didn't come out, those women were expected to drop. Did y'all watch Bletchley, for example? What happened? Those women were doing code cracking. They were winning the war, and the war was over, and they were expected to go home and do absolutely nothing. Right. So that comes up in Fred's book also. So I don't want to say they're lifestyle books because that doesn't sound right, but it's really interesting reading. It was only 100 years ago, not even 100 years ago. How different it is from where we're now, but also how much the same these problems are, just in different dress.
I've even thought because Al Fair's husband raises horses, horse farmer. And in one of the books he said, well, people always need horses. So,
They had cavalry in World War I, and they didn't really have cavalry.
He got a
in
lot
World
of
War
money
II.
out of mules and horses. He made a bundle during the war.
Yeah.
But times they is a changing.
Yeah.
That's right. Now, any of you have questions you'd like to ask either author, both authors?
Answer every possible question.
We have answers. They may not be right, but we got always have an answer.
There's one way back there.
Joan.
Donis, I love reading your books just because of the way you use your words, and especially the Oklahoma dialect. Is that something you're totally familiar with? I mean, it's dying out. It's not like you can
That's
go to
right.
Oklahoma and hear that dialect.
Yeah, she said she likes the dialect that I use in the books, and yes, that's something that I am totally familiar with. And there's quite a difference between, now I know I have an accent, but there's quite a difference between an accent and a dialect and the way that people put their words together. And I grew up listening to that very much because my grandparents are the same age as the children in these books, the older children in these books. And so that's the way they spoke. And my grandparents were the most educated one, went to the 8th grade. And one of my grandfathers only went to the 3rd grade, and he had to drop out and take over the farm. So they were semi-literate and incredible language that was almost Elizabethan. They'll go over, over yonder. They'll talk about young person and that sort of thing. So yes, it's quite a dialect, and it is very much dying, and it's very much gone. And one thing that I really wanted to do was to preserve a lot of that way of speaking in the books without being too ununderstandable, if that's a word.
Your grandparents were their age. My parents were their ages.
Oh, you're just showing off your.
I think it's so funny though, because it's a matter of perspective. When I was teaching at this little school down in Avondale, this young boy, Kevin, was 14 or so, and he came to me and he said, my great-grandfather fought in the Second World War. And I said, Kevin, my great-grandfather fought in the Civil War. He could not get his mind around that. It might have well been Ivanhoe or something. Just too much.
It just amazes me when I write about these things, because it was not that long ago.
Yeah.
It just really was not that long ago. I mean, it's like, I was a little girl in the 50s, and now that's like it was Ivanhoe now.
Your history.
Yeah, that's right. We're history now. That's just incredible.
That's true. If you survive, what happens is your life does turn. Whoops, sorry, I turned that off.
If you
survive long enough, your life does turn into history. I mean, my war was the Vietnam War, and you know, that really is
It's now, they're writing
History.
about it in history, yeah.
right. We've all moved on. When you say the war now, it doesn't really mean
No.
the Second World War in a way that for forever when people said the war, that's what they meant, was the Second World War. Anybody else have a question? Come on, people, wake up.
Remember, the 19th Amendment was passed in 1919.
They voted on it during the war in 1918, but it didn't pass by 2 votes. They were going to wait till after the war to do it. And it passed in 1919, went into effect in 1920.
Yep.
And prohibition, too.
Yeah, same time. I don't know if they're causally related, but women's votes and prohibition.
Because the whole women's movement started out as being prohibition, you know, carrying nation, that sort of thing.
I grew up right next to Evanston, Illinois, which, if those of you remember, was the home of the Women's Christian Temperance Union, and very big around Northwestern universities. So, yeah, I mean, in a more unlikely place than suburban Chicago for a temperance movement. It's pretty hard to imagine, but, you know, because we all know what Chicago was like during Prohibition. I don't know. I just always thought it was bizarre.
I have a question for Donis. Could you talk to us about how closely related your books are to your family history?
How closely related are my books to my family history? Pretty darn close, I have to say. It started out much more so than it's, you know, than as the years go on, I go further afield. But I started out after having done a genealogical study for one of my sisters, and I discovered so many incredible tales that you don't realize how your own relatives are history. They're the ones who did it. And when I discovered I had relatives on both sides of the Civil War. I come from that middle part of the country, that border country. So I had relatives on both sides of the Civil War. I had all kinds of incredible tales about ambushes and axings and murders and people running off with one another. And I had a lot of murders in the family that I could actually use in my books.
That's not convenient. I mean, not all of us can say
It's
that.
very convenient, yeah.
And how did those stories get passed down to you?
Well, my grandparents were all from up in the hills, and they were all big yarn tellers and tale tellers and stuff. And we had so many. My grandmother had all these stories about her Uncle Ed. And her Uncle Ed was the laziest person that ever lived on the face of the earth. And one time he cut off his own toe so that he wouldn't have to go out in the field and work. And one time they found him trying to hang himself because he didn't want to go. He didn't want to go to work. And it was all of these ways that he tried to get out of work. And there's just all these different weird tales, and she'd go on and on and on and on and on. And then when she was about 85 years old, one of my sisters said, "Grandma, are those tales true?" And she said, well, maybe. They sound good, you know. And a lot of Indian background as well. And a lot of the stories are my husband's stories, too. Because his family is also his great-grandfather came to the Indian Territory running away from something we don't know what, and married a Choctaw woman. And spent some time in prison for shooting somebody in self-defense, a Choctaw man, his wife's brother, I believe it was. And I use that tale in one of my books as well.
You two have
So-
bad DNA, you know.
It's American as can be, American as can be. And my grandparents lived out on a subsistence farm. No electricity. My grandmother did the wash in the tub, which is what I used on the back over a fire in the backyard, which I used in the first book, that tale. So it's very much my own background. It's totally gone now, totally gone. However, one of my father's cousins still lives in the house that I write about. Yeah, and I actually went back to see the house in 2006, and they invited me to come in and look at it. I just couldn't believe it. I hadn't been in it since my grandmother died in the 70s, but it's much smaller than I remembered. And she raised all those kids in this 2-bedroom house.
And it's haunted too.
incredible. Huh?
It's haunted too.
Oh, it is haunted, yeah, that's right. They were telling us about the woman in the polka dot dress that wanders around in the attic and comes out the door and stuff like that, so, yeah, it was really
So you
fascinating.
have a chance to write a ghost story. Wow,
Oh,
come on,
that's,
Don. Better go on that. I
Well,
love it.
they believe in ghosts, you
I
know,
know.
they still do.
That would be really interesting. Fred, why do you write about the Shenandoah Valley so much?
That's a long story, which I will try to make very short. When I was going to Washington and Lee University, it was an all-male school. So that if you wanted female companionship, you had to drive someplace, to Hollins or to Sweetbriar or to Randolph-Macon. And I went to Randolph-Macon, which is, I think, 45 reverse curves through the mountains. And one or two of my friends didn't make it. But anyway, Randolph-Macon had this storage facility. Now, this was back in the mid-50s. And you remember bomb shelters. Those of you old enough to remember bomb shelters. It was built like a bomb shelter. It was one story above ground and like 4 floors underneath. And half of the Mellon art collection at any one time was stored in there. And I assumed, I think correctly, but they deny it, I assumed that was their way of preserving half their collection should there be this attack. I mean, who's going to drop a nuclear device on Lynchburg, Virginia?
Well, actually, that's what the British did. They took the National Gallery of Art, the British stuff, and put it in mines in Wales, you know, to get it through the war. It wasn't unreasonable to do that.
So, but they say, no, it's a storage facility. Never mind. Anyway, I went through it, and I saw the pictures and how they were up on racks, and you could go down. And I thought, what would happen if someone stole this stuff? And if they did, what would you do with it? Because it's cataloged, it's the Mellon art collection. It's not like, oh gosh, I wonder where this came from. Everybody would know. And so that was in the back of my mind. And so we fast forward 30 years or so, and my wife is talking to me, and we had a brief commuter marriage, and she said, what would you like to do if you could do anything? And glibly, I said, oh, I would write a book, just to impress her. And she said, why don't you? And I thought, this is a lot of words. Why would you want? I didn't know anything about writing.
We know who to blame
now. But I did know it was a lot of words, and I wasn't really ready to do that. But so I gave her all the usual excuses, right? You all use them. You don't have time. Mine was, I don't know how to type. I figured that I'm off the hook. This is before computers, so not knowing how to type should have gotten me off the hook. And she said, I'll type it. She took my excuse away. And so I wrote the first book in longhand with a fountain pen on legal pads. And she typed it. And then we would sneak in and make copies on the Xerox. Remember in those days, Xerox cost a lot of money. And you had a little box. Remember the little box? And you put the little box in, and then we count how many copies you guys made it. And if it was too many, you got a letter from somebody. So we would go in and knock out maybe 20 pages at a time and kind of buried it with all that. And we made 3 copies. And we sent them around, and some people liked it. And one of Susan's friends knew a guy. His name was Robert Raymond. Is that a great name? Sounds like he was a Hollywood agent. I thought, I'm going to get rich and retire, and rich and famous. I can't miss. So we gave him this book, and it was called Schwartz. And he said, nobody reads this stuff anymore. He said, write me a big book, Fate of the World Hanging in the Balance. He wanted Robert Ludlum. So I figured, write 1 book, write 2 books. How hard can it be, right? So I wrote a big book with the Fate of the World Hanging in the Balance, and by then we have a computer. It's a TSR-80. Probably the worst computer ever designed by man, ever. It won't even make a good boat anchor. So anyway, and so I wrote this big book. In the meantime, I get a call from a guy named Murray Fisher. And Murray calls and says, I'm an agent and I can help you with I'm an editor, I can help you with your writing. You send me chapters and we'll send them back and forth, and I have to charge you. I thought, somebody's trying to pick my pocket. So I called Robert. I said, Robert, who's Murray? And he said, oh, he can really help you. You should go with Murray. I thought, okay. So I sent Murray $100, which at that time was $100 more than I had. And I figured, and so I'm writing, still read longhand, so she can type it in the computer. I'm writing this book, and I keep sending him chapters, and I don't hear from Murray. And after a while, I have finished the book, and I still haven't heard from Murray. And then I get this call from him. He says, I read all your stuff. He says, I can't help you. You can write, so I'm sending your money back. I thought that was nice, and he did. He sent me money back. And I haven't heard from Murray since. But anyway, Robert took this, so he had to make 7 copies on a dot matrix printer. So all night this thing's going bang, 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 bang. You know, these things are folding off and it's big, and you have to tear the little things off. 7 copies of a book that was probably 250 pages. That's a lot of people. So we sent it out to Robert, and I'm waiting to get rich and famous because he's a Hollywood agent, and you can't go wrong with that. Obviously, I'm thinking, I wonder where Tom Clancy's doing this afternoon. I need to ask him out to lunch. And Robert writes back and said, I can't sell your book. He said, write me another one. And I said, I don't think so. I think I'm done with this. So fast forward a bunch of years, and I'm trying to write a book about Judas because that was an interest I have and had and still do. And I hear about the Poison Pen Press, and I have this Schwartz book. And by now I've been to a couple of conferences and figured out this point of view stuff and commas, and I never got the commas
No,
right.
Fred,
But
you
I got
never
the rest
learn
of it.
commas, no.
I'm still a creative comma user, and I'm going to give a course in creative comma. But anyway, so I sent Schwartz off to them while I was trying to do some other things, and they liked it, and I thought and they bought it, and I thought, holy cow! And
Now you're rich and famous.
now I'm rich and famous. I am, but Tom hasn't returned my call. So.
If you listen to that, let's hark back to Fred's idea for writing a book about cell phones and super and whatever, and think about the arc that we have just traveled with Fred. Isn't that amazing? All the way from writing his book with a fountain pen through that. So, Fred encapsulates in one lifetime technological arc of America. Fred.
No, I wrote with the fountain. I still have the fountain pen. I wrote the nib off it. To tell you the truth. It was
Well, we
with the
can't.
kind of with a little squeaky thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We can't top that. So I think that this is a moment where we should probably thank you all for coming. Now, let me just say 2 things. If you're interested in Arizona history, tomorrow night, Jeff Gwynne has his 3rd really wonderful Western crime novel called Silver City. It comes after Glorious and Buffalo Trail, and Patrick is going to host him because Patrick is really interested in Arizona history, so that'll really be fun. And then we have some other stuff happening, but on February 4th, Betty Webb, who is here, Betty, stand up, take a bow. Betty will be here with her 9th Lena Jones novel, which is a Scottsdale private eye, and this one has particularly fabulous reviews and a fabulous plot, and we'll bribe you with food. So come at 2 o'clock and join us there. Poison Pen Press's Priscilla Royal, who writes medieval mysteries, will be here February 11th. And Donis is going to come and do a program with Mary Anna Evans, and one of her books, which is in Oklahoma archaeology. It is about digging up an Indian village in Oklahoma. We're in a lot of red dust in this book. And there's a lot also about Indian lore and Indians in Oklahoma. So those are not the only events we're doing. Those are just the highlights of Poison Pen Presidents.
Did you
Yes,
say
ma'am.
Jacqueline Winspear?
March 13th. I can tell you what we're doing between now and June 19th. Don Winslow, June 19th, right. Now, we have an amazing schedule coming up. If you like, there's a new postcard up on the desk. Our website is current, and you could sign up for our e-newsletter, in which I will tell you not only who's coming, but in case anything goes wrong. It's the only way I have to say to you, the author's flight got canceled, or whatever, and we're rescheduling or whatever we're doing. So it's really helpful to read that if you are interested in doing that. We have almost an event a day in February, I think, and in March, and we have some really It's Jacqueline Winspear and Brunonia Berry, and I can't remember, we have weeks like that. We have Randy White and C.J. Fox like back to back, and all kinds of fun stuff. But you know what? None of it would happen without you. So I really want to thank all of you. If you can come out and support the authors, come and hear their programs, buy their books, we would just go away. So it's all about you guys. So on behalf of all of us in Poison Pen Press, the staff over here, thank you for coming this evening. If you would like to stand up and fold up your chairs and lean them against any surface, and if you wouldn't mind vacating those seats over there, Donis and Fred are going to go over there. You can get your book signed, take photos, say anything you want. Thank you for coming. And Happy New Year, in case I forgot that.
No, that's fine. It really is fine. You want to go?
Thank you.